So thank you all for coming. I would also like to acknowledge that the CKR and the Institute of Asian Research in which it is housed are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So let me make one quick announcement, which is that so far the next talk that we have scheduled is for April 8th, which is Thursday, so a little bit different from our usual Friday. So Thursday, April 8th, and that will be Cedarbow Seiji talking about, well, the title is From Youthful Idols to Elderly Treasures, an examination of performers as cultural ambassadors of the nation. And we might squeeze in one more kind of more policy-oriented speaker in late April, early May. I'm still working on that. But let me now introduce today's speaker. So we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Immanuel Kim from George Washington University. He is the Korea Foundation and Kim Renault Associate Professor of Korean Literature and Culture Studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at George Washington University. And I was just stalking him on the GWU website, and I don't know if this is correct, Immanuel, but it says you're department chair.
I am the acting chair, yes.
Oh, well, so proving once again that no good deed goes unpunished. So, you know, making an associate professor be a chair, that's really harsh. So anyway, I know your pain, or having done that recently. And Immanuel did his PhD in Comp Lit at the University of California, Riverside. And what's so exciting about his general existence in the world is that I'm sure all of you will agree that the great majority of all the discourse around North Korea in Korean studies and in the press is always about nukes and famine and IR and, you know, security issues, and all the policy wonks are sort of taking up all the airwaves, and no one talks about North Korean culture. And yet there's so much to talk about. So he is a rare scholar of North Korean culture in our midst, and has been very productive just in the last few years. He's got 2 monographs out and a translated novel. So his first book was Rewriting Revolution: Women's Sexuality and Memory in North Korean Fiction. That's 2018 from University of Hawaii Press. And then last year, Laughing North Koreans, Culture of the Film Industry, which is about North Korean comedy films. And both of those books start in the 1960s and come up to the present. And then in the meantime, he's also just last year published Friend, a novel from North Korea by Peng Nam-nyo from Columbia University Press. And I understand that Immanuel is working nowadays, or continuing, in various kinds of media studies, TV and sitcoms. So today his presentation is titled "A Good Wife is Hard to Find: Shifts in the Representation of Women in North Korean Literature." Immanuel, we usually go 45-50 minutes and then do the Q&A. And when we get to Q&A, in the meantime, I hope you'll all put yourselves on mute. And for Q&A, as we're going along, I would encourage everybody, if you have questions, to sort of formulate them, you know, in the background, and then put them in chat, and that'll make things more efficient when we get to Q&A. So again, thank you so much, Immanuel Kim, for being with us, and please join me in welcoming Professor Kim.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rosking. And, you know, it's a pleasure for me to give this presentation, because it always excites me to talk about North Korean culture. But I feel like I need to address the tragedy that happened in Atlanta, and I'm sure you guys all heard. It's devastating, and I really hope the Koreatown in Georgia, Atlanta, will be able to just rejuvenate from this tragedy. But, you know, thanks again for the generous, really generous introduction. And today what I wanted to talk about is North Korean literature. And just to give you an idea of my approach to North Korean literature, when I began my research, I was at the North Korean library, which is in South Korea, the national library there. And I started from the very beginning, the 50s all the way to present. And I read all these short stories, novels. And initially I thought, oh my gosh, all these stories just sound the same. They look the same. I just feel like they switched Comrade Kim to Comrade Lee, and your city changed from one name to another, but the storyline was generally the same. And I was really disheartened by my research. I was thinking, can I go anywhere with this? What can I do with all this seemingly propagandistic stories? And after really going through each story, I noticed a trend. I noticed a pattern in North Korean literature, and it really had to do with women. And of course, not all stories have what I'm going to talk about today, but again, it's a pattern, right? So generally, to give you guys an idea, North Korean short stories, novels, they have to have a pretty singular meaning, a singular idea that the reader could take away. If you don't get the message, then number one, the writer must not have been a good writer. Number two, you are not a good reader, right? You didn't quite understand what the story was about. But for any of you guys who've read North Korean short stories or novels, it's pretty clear what the message is. And again, the party wants a certain singular message. What I've noticed is women in these narratives tend to disrupt, tend to question, challenge this norm, this singular meaning. And to me, that was so refreshing. I'm so glad that there's this character who can disrupt this social, political, linguistic norm. And today, this is what I want to present to you. And we will look at the shifts from the 1960s to all the way to the 80s. So I will share my screen. So a good wife is hard to find. Borrowing and parodying from Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. But also, North Korean literature really emphasizes good wife, wise mother. And women in these narratives challenge and subvert this political ideology. But let's start from the beginning. Post-war, right after the Korean War, North Korea undergoes this movement called the Chollima Movement. And Chun in Korean is 1,000. Lee is a distance. It's not quite a mile, but it's easier for us to understand. I think it's like, I forget, 5 kilometers. I don't really know what it is. No, it can't be that. I'm sorry, I take that back. And then Ma is horse. So when you combine it together, Chollima, it's a legendary horse that represents, for North Korea, the post-war national reconstruction period. And this is a moment in North Korean history where the party called on the people to really rebuild, reconstruct the country at a very quick pace. And the reason they chose Chollima as their mascot was to outpace South Korea. So both Koreas after the war suffered a devastating tragedy. And Kim Il-sung called on his people to build the country faster and better than South Korea. And for the most part, they did. They were rather successful in this. South Korea in the 50s was still in shambles. Right? So North Korea felt, well, they have one up on South Korea. They're very proud of that history. They quickly rebuilt the heavy and light industries. Textile industries was huge in North Korea at the time. Just to give you an idea, the heavy industries, the textile, light industries. Kim Il-sung, a great photo op here, chipping in and helping out his people, showing the spirit of the Chollima movement. And of course, you can't deny the horse, right? The mascot for this. It's the Chollima poster. And the worker is on the horse, pointing his finger at the people, us, saying, "Comrade, are you on the Chollima? Are you on the horse? Are you prepared to do your job?" And this is very reminiscent of like Second World War here in the United States, Uncle Sam pointing at the Americans. Are you prepared to go into war for us? And then we move into 1960s literature, which I think at the time was probably the most vibrant, exciting moment in North Korean literary history. It was all about reconstructing the country. Right? So a story might take place in a village, it might take place in a small town. However, it was emblematic of the entire nation. So by rebuilding the village, you're essentially rebuilding the country. And it really had that Chollima spirit in the narrative. Right? It was a very innovative moment in the 1960s. So we have a lot of these politician kids who went to study in East Berlin, in Moscow, a Polytechnic Institute, and they're coming back to North Korea with all these new ideas, new science and technology, and implementing it into their society. So when you read short stories or novels during this time, you have a lot of this new technological terminologies coming in, borrowed from Moscow, from Germany. You have all these cranes building and erecting tall monuments or tall apartment buildings. You have chemical terminologies, right? Because they studied physics, chemistry, and biology abroad, and they're bringing it all back. And this is becoming a new language in literature, and it's really exciting to read. Of course, you can't miss the collectivity aspect of it. Right? Everyone is joining together, working together in one spirit, and that is the Chollima spirit. Generally across the 1960s, you see the general theme is competition. And it's factory A competing against factory B. Ship A battling ship B. And they're all comrades, but the idea is who can catch more fish, who can produce more steel, right? And at the end of the day, oh, Comrade Park, excellent, 400%, and so forth. And everyone claps, and it's supposed to motivate the readers to work harder in their workplace. But what's also interesting, and I like this about 1960s literature, is that everyone gets tired at the end of the day, right? So they work all day, and then they come home and they collapse. And to me, that's the most human part of reading these stories, right? Of course you're tired. The party is demanding 120% from you, and you'll do it during the day, but when you come home, you're just exhausted. One of the famous works in 1960s, and quite possibly my favorite writer in the 1960s, is a woman writer by the name of Lee Jong-suk. And she wrote 산새들, Mountain Birds. It was bound as a book in 1966, but it was originally serialized starting from 1963 in North Korea's literary journal. And it's about the textile industry. It's about women working in the textile industry. Some women facing family issues, some women facing dating, problems with her boyfriend or fiance. And overall, the main character is a manager who is haunted by her past. And the whole novel is about her overcoming her issue with being, coming from a small village and trying to compete in a larger urban area. Not only that, she's a woman manager, and she has to deal with all these other men, male managers who are giving her a lot of pressure. So this is a fantastic work in general, looking at the difficulties women face every day. So 1960s women across the literature, we see tons of working women. All the women are working. No one is just a housewife or anything of that sort. Everyone is eager to go out and do something for the country. And again, this innovative characters are also into women, bringing back science and technology. And of course, they're always fighting for gender equality, borrowing from the Soviet Union's gender equality, socialist ideas. The women are really fighting for this. And then you see in some works of literature, you see women with strong sense of agency, fighting back, demanding certain things in her workplace, challenging her husband, challenging the party secretary or whatnot, right? You see the voice of women really loud and clear in the 1960s literature. And this is really interesting because what was happening alongside the literature was a competing discourse that was trying to promote the personality cult of the Kim family. So you got the writers' union, and you got writers in the writers' union writing exciting work in the 1960s. But then you have other writers within the writers' union who are coming up with this personality cult of the leader's family. And they start to clash. They're not compatible. Eventually, the personality cult will take over the existing voice of the writers' union. Kang Ban-seok, and that's how the North Koreans spell her name, she is considered the revolutionary mother, AKA Mother of Korea. She is the mother of Kim Il-sung. And apparently she, according to her biography and her novelized stories, she was a great revolutionary. And by that, it does not mean that she was out there fighting alongside men. It means she was taking care of the family. She took care of Kim Il-sung and his brothers. She cooked and cleaned and prepared the house for her husband to come and eat and rest. So this was a real competing discourse against the exciting 1960s literature where women were really active and presenting this voice. It really gets truncated with this discourse about Kang Ban-seok. Here's a little statue of her. Kim Jong-suk, Kim Il-sung's first wife, is also considered mother of Korea. So Kim Il-sung's mother, Kang Ban-seok, is the mother of Korea. His wife is also the mother of Korea. Little incestuous, but that's not what it means, right? It's just a symbol of this motherhood that North Korea is trying to recreate and present and project onto the people. Women should emulate my mother and my wife because these two women are the pillars of what femininity is in North Korea. Here's a family painting. This is apparently in Mount Baekdu, where supposedly Kim Jong-il was born, and we all know that's not true. But they took a nice family portrait there. And again, this is the image of a revolutionary, successful, harmonious family unit in North Korea. I call it the Kim Jong-il trauma because I think of all the things that Kim Jong-il did wrong in his career, I think this was the critical moment, a critical mistake that he made. And it really changed the projection of where the country was going. On April 15th, 1967, the party holds a meeting. But this is not a general meeting. So I'm sure you've seen in media, this huge auditorium with all these members of the party sitting there clapping for the new leader or whatever it is. That's the general plenary meeting. We're not talking about that. This was a smaller gathering. And at this gathering, they decided to change North Korea and establish three pillars One of them is the ideology, Juche being the governing state ideology. The other one was rehistoricizing North Korea's past, right? So rewriting the historiography of North Korea. Rather than saying that North Korea was established in 1948, we're going to bring it back to the colonial period. We're going to take it back to like 1932. When Kim Il-sung was only 20 years old, that's when he established North Korea, truly North Korea. So they rewrote the historiography. And the third one is the one that I find to be the most problematic, and that's the changing of the entire cultural landscape. Basically, what Kim Jong-un did at this point was he wanted to, he wanted the literary and all the artistic production in North Korea to venerate his father and eventually him. And when you come across a story that has Kim Il-sung in it and they glorify the party and glorify him, well, you have to look at the date of when it was written, right? Most likely it was written after 1967. Because prior to 1967, sure, some writers mention the leader, but he was never the focal point. But as soon as April 15th, 1967 hits, you see a drastic, dramatic, almost an obvious change. And to some extent, some of the writers were pressured to continue writing about his father, even though they didn't want to write about his father. It also changed the way people speak. So you hear whenever North Koreans are interviewed, the first few things that they say is they honor the great leader. Oh, thank the great leader for doing this and doing that. Again, that was changed. After 1967, people started to speak in a different way. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you can see the date, but it says here, March 12th, 1967. This is the headline, a typical headline in North Korea. The Nodong Shinmun is the state newspaper, Workers' Daily. And this, before April 15th, 1967, you have these kind of headlines where it's just talking about the party and what the party expects. Sometimes it would talk about a good comrade who did something extraordinary and, typical headline stuff that you'll see in any news. And then if you look at the bottom left over here, you'll see a small article about Kim Il-sung. Right? And when I looked at all these newspaper, the front page of newspapers prior to April 15, 1967, this is a common thing. Sometimes Kim Il-sung wouldn't even be on the front page. But after April 15, 1967, you get newspapers like this. Right? The headline is all about Kim Il-sung. What did he do? He's standing in front of Mount Baekdu. Big deal. But they're going to make a big deal out of it and put it across the front page, headline, and so forth. Again, the style, format, the language, it all shifted. So 1970s literature, what can we find? Well, it was a new national movement. If the late 50s and 60s was about the Chollima, rebuilding the country and having that spirit, the new national campaign is the Three Revolutions campaign. The first one is ideology, technology, and culture. So ideology is pretty clear. Stories should have the Juche ideology within it. And as a side note, this was very difficult for writers to do. How do you implement Juche ideology into a story? A lot of South Korean scholars who study North Korean literature categorize 1970s literature and film as Juche art. I don't really understand what that means. How do you categorize it? What makes it Juche? What is it in the story that you can sense that this is a strong Juche ideology? It's really difficult. But South Korean scholars don't seem to have a problem categorizing it and generalizing it as Juche ideology, Juche literature. Therefore, it's not really worthy to read. Okay. But what's in these literature, in short stories and novels, is technology. This is a little bit different from 1960s technology. they're trying to advance even more than the 1960s, but not because there were students studying abroad and bringing back new ideas. No, the difference here is North Korea realized that South Korea's technology is well advanced. They're on their way, right, to a brighter future. And they felt that they were slightly behind South Korea at this point. So they were urging their people to create this new technology and try to catch up with South Korea. And culture is, well, you have music, you have art, painting, film, literature, all kinds of arts that at this point is all about the personality cult of Kim Il-sung and later on Kim Jong-il. Alongside that is the Speed campaign. These were the two major national campaigns that dominated 1970s. The problem with the Speed campaign is Kim Jong-il expected quantity over quality. And the writers had a certain quota to fulfill, and maybe they had to produce 10 short stories a year rather than a few. And there's a lot of pressure on the writers. And I believe this explains why 1970s short stories and novels are pretty bland. If you read one, it looks like the other one because these writers, they're under so much pressure and they lose a sense of creativity that it almost looks like a carbon copy of the previous short story that they've written. And this was a shame, really. The 1970s was a huge problem in North Korea. What were some of the literary themes in these short stories? Well, again, as I said, falling behind. Comrade, you're falling behind. This generational difference, older generation versus the younger generation. You gotta learn the latest technology and come join us. You gotta move forward with technology. And the only thing that really struck a chord with me when I was reading through the 1970s literature is me trying to teach my parents how to use a mobile phone and internet. And it was really frustrating to show and demonstrate, Mom, this is how you do this, right? And she just didn't get it. But after a while, she finally got it. And now she can't stop sending us videos and all kinds of news through text messaging, right? In the 1970s, there were clear masterpieces, or at least self-proclaimed masterpieces. One is A Sea of Blood, which was also made into a film. And of course, The Flower Girl. The Flower Girl was so culturally impactful that it was on their currency, or her face was on the currency. And these are masterpieces because these two films were produced by and allegedly directed by Kim Jong-il himself. We don't know how true that is, but that's what the country states. And these two women, again, in 1970s, these two women portrayed this motherhood, the same kind of motherhood that Kang Ban-seok and Kim Jong-suk portrayed. So what happened in the mid-1960s to really project this motherhood image is now well into the 70s. They're really projecting this and really getting the people to understand that a good woman is a good wife and a wise mother. And if you're none of those, you're not a good woman. Shame on you. You need to be re-educated. So the family revolution, 가족혁명 idea really is present in literature. And it becomes the common rhetoric. It's shown in films, it's shown in short stories, novels, it's shown in all kinds of popular culture. And you see these posters, propaganda posters of a family unit. And the woman is always dressed in her, not only in her hanbok, but in this domestic clothing. Like she was working in the house. And the women had to, or not just the women, but men as well, had to go through this re-education reminding the men, hey, don't forget, a good woman is someone who can cook, clean, and rear your children. And this notion of domesticity. Let's bring the woman back from the workplace and have her stay at home. Kim Il-sung makes this very famous speech at, with all these women, the Women's Union, which is a large union in North Korea. And there he gives his speech, the duty of mothers in the education of children. Mother has to bear the majority responsibility of the home education because it is she who gives birth to the children and brings them up. So what we see here is we get this idea that, well, the mother is the one, the woman is the one who bears the children. Okay, I could, biologically, I get that. But then it's the second part and brings them up. Why is it only the mother? Why is it only the woman who raises the children? What happened to the men? Well, the men are out working. The men are the voice of the society, politics. They're the 바깥 남자, right? They're the outside. Whereas the woman must remain at home. 안해. In North Korean, wife is called 안해. And again, this political rhetoric is continually emphasized throughout the 1970s. Now come the 1980s. And this is where there's a huge shift. The national campaign is called the Hidden Hero Campaign. And the slogan of the Hidden Hero Campaign is doing great for the country when nobody is watching. It's very reminiscent of JFK's inaugural speech. Ask not what the country can do for you. Ask what you can do for the country. And that is essentially what the Hidden Hero Campaign is supposed to project to the people. It's urging the people to do something great for the country, and we don't have to know about it. Of course, the paradox is, well, then how do you determine that person to be the hidden hero if you didn't know what that person did? Because every month in Nodong Shinmun, they would announce, oh, Comrade Lee is this month's hidden hero. Well, how did you know that Comrade Lee was the hidden hero when that person was doing something when nobody's watching? Well, somebody was watching. Right? What 1980s literature shows is more room for creativity and self-expression. I think at this point, North Korea felt that they were really behind South Korea. Not only that, early in the 1980s, the IOC International Olympic Committee announced the Summer Games will happen in Seoul in '88. And Seoul was really, or South Korea was really excited about this. And they underwent a huge infrastructural change and rebuilding the country and so forth. When North Korea knew about this, they also asked the IOC, well, could we co-host with South Korea? IOC rejected it. North Korea interestingly came back and said, are you guys aware of what's happening in South Korea right now in 1980s? Have you not seen the news? Do you not know what's happening with Gwangju? People are dying. They're slaughtering people over there. You're going to allow the Summer Games to happen in Seoul? This is crazy. This is madness. Whereas in our country, we don't kill each other. We love each other and so forth. So they were really trying to make a case to the IOC, and IOC just would not have it. Meanwhile, this whole time, 1985, I believe, was one of the first times when the North and South agreed to allow the families to reunite. What was North Korea trying to do? Well, they were trying to show the world, hey, we're not that bad. You know, we're cool, right? We're just like you. And in order to do that, they had to change their image. And this was Kim Jong-un's move to showing the world that they are as normal as any other country. And they allowed the writers and the filmmakers to produce work that was radically different from the past. The general theme across the 1980s literature is a heavy emphasis on this different kind of woman, different from the motherhood image of women. There's a little bit of sexuality creeping in, and certainly in film, and this obvious criticism toward officials. Now, literature cannot criticize the leaders, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un. However, the upper management, middle management is fair game. And there was a sense of kind of this, the readers were really able to connect with these stories because of this pent-up frustration with having to deal with their managers every day. And now these stories are criticizing them, and you see how these managers are thrown out of their the company or the factory, and it's a feel-good story. Like justice has been served. And what's interesting is this doubting women, which I find really extraordinary, fascinating. And I'll talk about that in this next section here. So to give you an idea, these are all famous, the novels that I'm about to show right now are all famous writers in North Korea, really prominent. Choi Ak-soo, for example, received the Kim Il-sung Award, and Kim Il-sung supposedly really adored Choi Ak-soo. In 1976, he wrote Pyeongyang Sigan. This is probably his magnum corpus, and it's about the rebuilding of Pyongyang using the latest technology. Again, following the three revolutions of rebuilding with technology and culture. Lee Ha is one of my favorite writers in North Korea, passed away not too long ago. And he wrote, in the 80s, he wrote this very interesting novel called 소금꽃, salt deposits, where people are working at salt mines, and the main character is struggling with trying to follow the party's direction, but he can't seem to let go of his kind of sexual desire for this woman who works alongside him. Absolutely fascinating story. Baek Nam-yong wrote Friend, but he also wrote after 60 years. And this is a generational story, the older generation versus the younger generation. And again, Baek Nam-yong was a great writer, so this is another good story. Hyangto Land is a really interesting story where all these young kids who grew up in a farm decide to no longer stay and become like their fathers and grandfathers. They're going to the urban city, right? They're gonna do something else with their life. Yeolmang, this was written in 1992, I believe. And again, this shows this ambition for change. The younger generation really, especially women. Women and sexuality in this one is really evident. And it really shows a new kind of country that these young generation North Koreans are imagining. So again, these are all famous writers, and none of these writers have Kim Il-sung in their stories. They don't venerate Kim Il-sung. So this generalization of, oh, all North Korean literature has to have or venerate the leaders, otherwise it won't get published. I don't know where they're getting that from, because we're not talking about, you know, amateur writers. We're talking about prominent writers in North Korea who publish on a regular basis without ever mentioning the leaders. So when people make that kind of generalization, I don't understand where they're getting their data from. 1984, Heights of Life. I'm going to be honest with you, this was a very long novel. Oh my gosh, I typically don't read novels this long, or I just don't have the patience to read novels this long. But this one, initially, I didn't like it because it really looked like a soap opera, Korean sentimental, over the top soap opera. I'm not too keen on those kind of stories. But then after reading it several more times, I realized, oh, there's something really interesting about this. And it's all about extramarital affairs. So Heights of Life is a story about extramarital affairs. Chune is the main character, and she's married, but her husband leaves the house every night at night to go off to do something for the party, for the country, which is already suspicious in and of itself. You're thinking, where are you going? It's like 11 o'clock at night. Oh, I'll be back, honey. I'm doing something for the party. Oh, okay. So that's suspicious in and of itself. Chune is a lonely housewife who works at a factory, but because she's neglected by her husband, she's always a little lonely. And she has a good friend in the factory. She's also married. And the husband is a really charismatic husband. And Chune and the friend's husband, they get grouped together and they're working on a project. And Chune's best friend at the factory is jealous. She doesn't like what's going on. So this is what Chune says. If my blueprint could be a small bolt in the future plans that our great leader has set out, there can be nothing greater than that. I will keep this thought with me as I work. Okay. In the past 1960s and not really 1960s, but certainly in the 1970s, if the main character says this, something like along the lines of this, that I'm doing something great for the great leader, everyone else in the story will basically succumb to it and say, yes, of course, you're right, right? You're doing something great for the great leader, of course, you're good. But not in the 1980s. People started to challenge this political rhetoric. In other words, they don't believe when people say this anymore. So Chune, the main character, says this, but her friend comes back and says this. Do you actually think those thoughts as you endure the obstacles in life? Do you really believe in what you're saying? In other words, are you kidding me right now? You're cheating on with my husband, and you're gonna throw out this sentence about, oh, I'm doing this for the great leader. Really? And the friend approaches her husband and says this, I cannot stop you from loving others, but please be discreet about it so that others will not see. And the husband, what's really interesting is doesn't deny, right? Doesn't say, no, honey, it's a complete misunderstanding. No, he goes, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And you're thinking, whoa, this is really juicy, right? Heights of Life, fascinating story. And of course, at the end of the story, the two couples, they get along and they realize that their love is for their husband or their wife, and it's not for the other friend's wife or husband. So, everyone gets back together. But again, in the middle part of the novel is absolutely juicy, and you're just like flipping through the pages, right? Friend. One of the things that struck me the most when reading Friend, very different from other novels, is the main character, the female character, who wants to divorce her husband and is demanding the judge to allow her to divorce her husband. The judge is refusing her and says, try to work it out. When the judge is the representative of the state. When the state says, listen, we are all about family revolution. You got to think about your husband. You got to think about your son. You got to think about your community members. Maintaining a family unit is essential in our country. That's what the state is saying. But the woman says this, I can't do that. I can't stand it anymore. And to me, this one simple or two sentences really encapsulates the mood, the theme, and this kind of woman agency in the novel. And this is the one sentence that really struck me and really stood out amongst all the other novels during this period. Because the woman in this novel really has this strong sense of voice and this resistance, this challenging of not only the patriarchal society, but the state. Morning Star, and I'll end with this one, is about a husband and wife. The wife is working somewhere else. The husband is the scientist, researcher who wants to do something great for the country. And this is their conversation. The husband says, I can only do my research if you help me. I would like for you to start as soon as possible. Jinsun, the wife, was shocked. Jinsun says, is that so? Replied Jinsun indifferently. She uttered something that was different from what she was really thinking. And this is really interesting, right? So in the 1980s literature, we get this, whatever people say is different from what they're thinking. Right? And in previous decades, you don't really get to see that. In previous decades, whenever a character says something, they mean it. But in 1980s, we see this dichotomy of whatever one says in public and whatever one believes and thinks behind the scene is different. Seokjin continued, I'm not asking you to quit your job. I'm asking you to assist me with my research. At times, you will have to conduct experiments. At other times, you will have to do some research at the library. If we do this together, then we could hold our heads up high before the state. When I finish my research, I will do everything for you. Again, in previous decades, if a main character says, if we do this together, then we can hold up our heads high before the state. That is a motivational call. And all the other characters around that main character would say, you're right. Let's do something great for the state. But Jinsun, ... has nothing to say. And then finally she says, do you think living like that will give you happiness and worth in life? Jinsun continued without skipping a beat. If you do think like that, then I fear it will be detrimental to our family. So this is rather interesting. The husband wants to do something great for the country, and his mind is on it. And again, in previous literature, if one does that, then every other character supports that husband or that character. But in 1980s, you don't see this. Whenever someone wants to do something great for the country, people around him says, are you serious? What about our family? You got to think about our family first. She gets so upset that at this research lab, there's a young woman, and Jinsun approaches this young woman and has this conversation with her. Youngum, don't ever get married. That's her first advice. You're young, don't ever get married. The second advice is, if you must get married, then enjoy your life, a single life when you're still young. The third one, after you've enjoyed your single life, then get married. This is really interesting because this is all hearsay. We don't know if it's true because it's not actually documented, but enough people have said it, so I don't know. You take it for whatever it is. In the 1980s, Kim Il-sung apparently made this passing remark that men should get married at the age of 30 and women should get married at the age of 28. How did he come up with this number? Well, the idea is, in your youth, you should work for the country. And after you've worked for the country, then you should get married and create a family and so forth. But what Jinsun is doing here is suggesting to Youngum the opposite of what Kim Il-sung said. Enjoy your single life. And if you do have to get married, you got to remember, it's not as dreamy as you think it is. And to me, this is absolutely fascinating. And Morning Star is another one of my favorite ones. Morning Star is written by a woman, female writer, and she is a prolific writer in North Korea, a great writer. And anytime she comes out with a novel, I tend to pick it up immediately and read it because I can almost, I know her style and I know what her general themes are. So it's always exciting to read her. Now, the one thing I don't like about North Korean literature, the one thing I think that, this whole notion of gender equality will take some time, is the linguistic problems. there's this hierarchical dialogue between men and women. For those who know Korean, the yo ending is the honorific ending. And women, when they speak to men, always speak in the yo form, the honorific form, while the men don't. And even between husband and wife, the husband will speak in this more informal, almost degrading language, whereas the wife is always submissive or has that tone. Right? So for me, it's really frustrating when I read North Korean literature that this fight for gender equality is on paper. However, in the actual linguistic formulation, in all of these narratives, there's this hierarchy. And unless they get rid of this hierarchy or equalize it, I don't foresee anything that is truly this kind of gender equality. I will stop here and take questions.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. So we're gonna go straight into questions from the audience. And I would ask you to put them into chat, please. And while you're all formulating some questions, maybe I can ask the first question because you've piqued my interest with your very last kind of complaint about North Korean literature there, and the business about gender equality or not in language, which is a topic dear to my heart. And I wonder if I can't challenge you a little bit, because you, in essence, the kind of your complaint is coming very much from a South Korean sort of way of thinking about the language. I mean, so I wonder if it isn't an unfair, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, yes, they push this, oh, women have to use yo and so on. And I think I shared with you a paper I have on that. But
Yes.
South Korea is just as hierarchical in its language use as North Korea is, so it's not unique to North Korea. Would you agree? Or
I totally agree.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. No, I'm just saying, right at the surface level, when you see this exchange between husband and wife or co-workers, supposedly co-workers, this disconnect between what the party wants. And so
then I guess my question follow-up then would be, I wonder if it isn't the case that I mean, and I since I haven't read any Korean fiction like you have, but tell me if this is maybe what's going on, that what you see in writing and in fiction is a very kind of stereotyped and unrealistic portrayal of the way people speak, because what's happening in the linguistics literature is clearly this is not the way women are speaking, and they're being disciplined to actually go back to this supposedly more hierarchical way. And so in that sense, I suppose it's really not very realistic dialogue.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, anyone who's read North Korean short stories, novels, or any even North Korean scripts, the dialogue is very rigid. By the way, it's not. It doesn't have this realistic progression, right? It's very that's all I can describe it. It's really rigid, and nobody speaks like that. So Sonia Rang made a comment about this, and she thinks that this is the way North Korea wants to educate the readers on how to address the other person.
Right.
Sure. I mean, I can buy that because there's no natural sense of this dialogue progression. So it's very unnatural sounding. So maybe it is
So it's
more
basically,
scripted.
in that sense, it's very traditional didactic function.
Yeah. In that sense, right.
So here's a question from Bruce and Chan Fulton. Can you say something about the literacy rate in North Korea? Who buys these books and how many? Where do they buy them? You know, what are the sales like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, when you say the literacy rate, are you talking about like the percentage of people who are supposedly literate? Because North Korea claims 100% literacy rate, right? I mean, you know, this is like, it's off the charts, right? Everyone's literate. So on the back of novels, you'll see a number ranging anywhere from 2,000 to, I've seen 200,000. And that is the number of prints. So the more ideological the novel is, the more prints. So if you see on the back of on the cover, 200,000, you can pretty much expect that this novel is going to be right down the line of what the party wants, right? And you're going to get the most typical North Korean story that you can ever imagine, right? I try to avoid those. Those are not the fun works to read. But I can't really say that because the Heights of Life had 100,000 prints. So that's considered pretty right down the line of what the party wants as well. And to give you perspective, Morning Star, the last story that I talked about, had about 10,000, I believe. And Friend only had about 7,000, I think, or even less than that. So for me, I see a pattern here. The lower the number, the party doesn't really like that story, right? And to me, those are the kind of stories you want to read, right? The ones that the party does not recommend.
There's a follow-up here from Bruce Fulton. He says he attributes the breakthrough of South Korean women's fiction in the 1990s in large part to the IMF crisis. Do you see any event of similar magnitude in the North that led to different images of women in fiction or increased visibility for North Korean women writers?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. The IMF also affected North Korea, but North Korea was already struggling with two other major events that devastated the country. The first one was the famine, and the second one was the death of the leader. So yes, the IMF was an international problem for them. However, it waned in comparison to the death of their leader, right? So at least that's how the culture, the society accepted that, right? The representation of women in the 1990s literature was taking the women back to the 1970s style. So the 1980s had this kind of glimmer of hope. And the whole country, I think, was really excited. Even the writers and other artists were really excited about what was happening in the 1980s. But with these two major devastating events in the early 1990s, it really brought them back to the 1970s style of domesticating the women and keeping them at home and watching them carefully. Really unfortunate. When it got to the 2000s, and now with Kim Jong-un in the 2010s, we see a younger generation coming back and trying to revitalize the society. So it's an interesting turn. So we see this kind of like roller coaster up and down shifts in the literature.
Okay, there's another question, still sticking with kind of readership here from Jihan Shin, one of our PhD students. Says, could you speak a little bit more about the readership of these works? You said some of them were serialized in literary magazines. How accessible and popular are these literary magazines among the public, and did the state encourage people to read these works?
Yeah, so in the early period, I've heard from defectors how the short stories would be read widely in factories, at their factory meetings, at their own study time sessions. You know, that was the form of educating themselves and entertaining themselves at the same time, right? these literary magazines and these pop culture magazines also had short stories in them as well. So stories were prevalent and very ubiquitous in North Korea. I'm going to go back to Sonia Rung because she visited North Korea in the 80s, and she said at the time that everyone was reading wherever she went. People were reading. And when I made my first visit to North Korea in 2008, I've also noticed that. I also noticed that people all over in the subway, waiting at a bus stop, they were reading either the newspaper, some journal, some book, or something of that. When I went back in 2015, everyone was looking at their cell phones, right? And they were reading off their cell phones. So they're still reading, but the medium has changed, right? But going back to the readership, how do you know when a novel did well in North Korea? So people tell me that if you find a North Korean novel, the cover and pages all falling apart, that is a good hit. That's a big hit in North Korea. It means it's touched many hands. It's been passed along from one hand to another, one family to another. And when I went to North Korea in 2015 and spoke with the author, Baek Nam-yong, he said he was on a bus and he saw this young woman reading his novel, and the covers were falling apart, the pages were falling apart, and he was so excited. He could not believe that his novel was doing so well that he approached the young woman and said, "Can I have that copy? I will get you a new one." Now, from his perspective, he wanted a souvenir. But from her perspective, this strange old man approaching her in a bus, asking her for this copy of the novel. She didn't know who Baek Nam-yong was, right? And so she looked at him and said, no, and she walked off the bus. Now, I gave a presentation on Friend, and I told this anecdote just like this. And afterwards, someone came up to me or emailed me and said, "You know what? When you said that story about Friend, I heard or I saw the same thing. Apparently, Gone with the Wind was really popular in North Korea. And there were volumes 1, 2, and 3. And this person, who later came up to me and spoke with me, he said he had volume 1 in his hand when he was leaving the country, or when he was leaving North Korea. And on that flight, a North Korean person leaned over and said, "Is that volume 1? I've been trying to get a hold of volume 1 forever. Can I read that while, on this flight?" And he said, "Absolutely." So in other words, volume 1, 2, and 3, people don't read in chronological order. It's whatever is available, right? Sometimes volume 3 is only available, so that's what they'll read first. So that's how it works, right? It's the cover and the pages falling apart.
Here's a question from our colleague, Christina Laffin, who's in Japanese pre-modern literature at UBC here. She says, "My understanding of North Korean literature is largely limited to the work that you translated, Friend, which she read this past fall. She's hoping you can talk a bit more about the function of the female characters in Friend, and she's interested particularly in your approach to female sexuality, agency, transgression or not, etc."
Wow, Christina, that's a huge question. I'm not sure if I could answer it in like a minute or so. But yes, so in the novel, there are different types of women presented. There is the typical wife who abides by the state protocols, and she is a loving, caring wife. And she stands against the main character who wants a divorce from her husband, right? So those two contrasts have to be present in order for the story to make sense. And the readers can pick and choose what kind of wife or what kind of woman the reader should be. And then there are other kinds of women present in the novel. One of my favorite characters in the novel is actually not the main character. She's fascinating, yes, but my favorite character is the judge's wife, who only makes an appearance at the end of the novel. And she appears for a moment, only to go back to her workplace and leave her husband stranded for like another month. And to me, the reason she's so fascinating is she breaks all the rules of what a woman should be, or what a wife should be, what a mother should be. The judge in the middle of the novel complains how he had to raise their only son by himself while she was out doing her work. And so to me, this kind of breaking the social norms, the cultural norms, what's expected from the party, is always refreshing to read. Right? I love her. Yes, the main character is nice too, right? She's definitely different from most women in other fiction. But the judge's wife is she tops it off for me. And in terms of women agency, it's really difficult to have this forthright woman who challenges the state, and disrupts this whole patriarchal norm. You're not going to see that kind of strong image of women like you see, for example, in, I don't know, South Korean literature. But the nuances there for me is already fascinating enough to see this kind of shift in how women were delineated and portrayed in previous decades. So for me, it's all contextual, right? You have to understand where the women were, how the women came to be in the 1980s. And that shift for me is just fascinating to trace.
Here's something from Hyungu. I said, many thanks for a stimulating talk. You mentioned the resistance of the female protagonist in Friend and in Morning Star and how they resisted the state. But the characters, after a struggle to digest and internalize the exhortations of the state, usually via a proxy, either a judge, a husband, or a party figure, reach a level of understanding at the end. And he's sort of musing, is this somewhat similar to TV dramas like Omar Keuji Mara, 2002, in the sense that while there's clearly more narrative tension in works from the 1980s and afterwards, are the novels and the dramas ultimately just more sophisticated in delivering the sophisticated didacticism of their lessons?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So you're always supposed to read it like that. You're always supposed to read it as a happy ending. The woman understands her place and she understands what the party expects of her. And she's going to go back to being that model mother figure, right? The wife figure. And in Heights of Life, you definitely see that. In Friend, I want to throw out and say it's a very ambiguous ending. I say that because the last scene is the wife coming back from her performance. At the train station, she is greeted by her son, husband, and the judge. And she has her head lowered. And if you read it carefully, that last passage, that last chapter, that last encounter with the judge, she does not say a single word. She greets her child who runs to her on the platform, and she hugs her and says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad to see you." And that's the only exchange she has. After that, she doesn't say a single word. And the judge takes the child and goes to the park, leaving the husband and wife to work things out. Well, we don't know if they actually work things out. You're supposed to read it like that. You're supposed to read they're gonna work something out. But the novel doesn't actually explicitly state that, right? So to me, this is always fascinating, right? This ambiguity at the end. And in Morning Star, there's that ambiguity as well. The wife comes back to her husband. So she left her husband for like a month or so. She wanted a divorce. She couldn't stand her husband, so she runs away. But then afterwards, staying with her friends and family, she comes back to her senses and she says, "All right, I guess I'll come back." So she comes back and the husband actually yells at her, "Where have you been? Right? We have so much work to do and I can't believe you left." and she doesn't say a word. And in fact, she doesn't even, so the story for her ends right there. And then the rest of the story is about her husband, how he does something wonderful for the state. What happened to the woman? Like, what's going on? What happened to this relationship? Do they actually work this out? Again, you're supposed to read it like that. You're supposed to read it as the woman submitted herself to the husband, and she's going to carry out this deed. But it's not explicit, right? And if you're going to leave it ambiguous, I'm gonna interpret it any way I want it, right? So there's a sense of liberty there, right? And to me, 1980s literature is fascinating in that way.
Here's a question from Mo Taylor. To what extent is contemporary North Korean fiction ever translated into foreign languages besides your translation?
So North Korea has this department called the Foreign Languages Publishing House. And all they do is translate their novels into foreign languages, multiple languages: Spanish, German, Russian, Chinese, Japanese. I'm not sure about Japanese. I take that back. So in other words, if South Korea has the Literature Translation Institute, LTI Korea, well, North Korea has had this foreign languages publishing house for much longer than KLTI. And their only job is to translate and disseminate their works to the people. Unfortunately, the works that they publish, or the works that they translate, are the ones that the party wants, right? Again, I told you, there are certain novels that the party recommends, and that's what they do, right? It's really unfortunate because they have a huge library of great writers, fascinating works that really need to be out there and have, for the people to read. And yet, because it's a state institution, they're only going to project what they want to project. And it's really unfortunate.
By the way, yeah, Hyung-woo confirms that they also do into Japanese.
Oh, they do? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, here's one from me again. So until your recent work, pretty much the only monograph length, treatment that we could read in English was Brian Meyer's book on Han Seol-ya and North Korean literature, where he says a great many caustic things, sometimes very entertaining, sometimes very smart. But he also sort of makes this strong claim that North Korea really doesn't have socialist realism. I'm just curious, what is your take on Brian Meyer's contribution in that book?
Yeah, so I think, given that it was written, I think in 94 or 90 something, there was a place and time for it.
Okay, that's pretty diplomatic. Yeah, okay. Oh.
But, after Brian Meyer's, Tatiana Gavrsenko came out.
Oh, of course, yes.
With her monograph from the University of Hawaii, Soldiers on the Cultural Front. And it really picks up from where Brian Meyer's left off. And, I think both of them do a great job of looking at this transition from the colonial period to the North Korean state, and looking at the shift, the imbalance of power between these former great writers during the colonial period and those who are competing to rise in the North Korean state. I think that's a great story to tell. And, they really touch upon a period that was really vibrant in terms of short stories, and the literary front was absolutely vibrant at the time. And it's a period that I really enjoy reading. But for me, I like to look at the post 1967 period, because the post 1967 period to present day is the type of literature that everyone just sort of dismisses, right? This is just propaganda, right? Previous to 1967, I think a lot of scholars would agree, even South Korean scholars would agree, that this is, albeit socialist realist style and tone, it still was pretty, you have your colonial writers like Lee Gyung, who's still producing in the 1960s. You have, of course, Hanseolya in the 1950s. You know, so you have all these familiar. Park Tae-won also continued writing up until a certain period, and then kind of faded out, right? So these are all familiar names that South Korean scholars love to look at and examine, cross-examine what happened to them. The 50s and 60s was a great time. I look at post 1967 because that's the hard kind of literature to read, right? Oh my God, this is like, can we find anything? Can we find a diamond in this rough, right? And for me, that challenge is always fun.
Here's another question from Bruce Fulton. Do you see any patterns in women's leisure activities in the literature and changes in those patterns? And what about men's leisure activity?
Yeah. So the common leisure activity that I see across these literature is women love to read. They read far more. Female characters read far more than the male characters. The male characters tend to just kind of play chess, so Chinese chess. Excuse me. They like to go and like wrestle with each other. You know, very typical masculine, I guess, if you want to call that, activities. Whereas women are always kind of reading, and that's a very typical image that I see. There's a pattern of that, very Victorian-esque. But other than that, no, not really. I think maybe film would project a better kind of leisurely, thing, but not so much in literature. Yeah.
All right. We're coming up on 20 minutes past here. Are there any other burning questions from the audience? Because now is kind of your chance to ask them. Can I just ask one last question then, Immanuel? Oh, here we go. Bruce again, or I don't know if, well, I don't know who it's from. Yeah, Bruce. Is the occupational status of writer something that's respected?
Yes, absolutely. So there's the writers union, and a subgroup of the writers union is called the April 15th Literary Production Unit. And those guys are tasked to novelize the historic events of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. These guys are really prized in North Korea. So much so that they're given an apartment, 3 meals a day, office to work in. And during the famine, the 90s, when it was really tough for people to survive in North Korea, I think a lot of writers chose to be part of this group just for survival's sake. And, there are people out there, scholars out there, who condemn these writers within the subgroup for being complicit to the political system. I wouldn't be so quick to judge, not based on what I've heard. So I think they had to do what they had to do to survive. Yeah.
All right, I hope you'll allow me one last question, and humor me, and that's asking you and everybody to humor me, just about literary style, because you started off by talking about, as you were reading, you felt that everything sounded the same and looked the same. So my first question is sort of 2 parts. I mean, how much stylistic diversity do you find in what you read in fiction? And then the other thing, and this is just because I'm really interested in Lee Tae-jun and the huge influence he had on what good style is, even in South Korea to this day. When does he lose his street cred in North Korea, or does he still have it at all?
I'll answer the last question first. I don't know. I don't know how far and what kind of street credit he has, and it's really unfortunate. But in terms of style, so for example, well, Bruce, you know, Hong Seok-jung, who wrote Hwangjini, beautiful writer. I mean, right? I mean, let's not deny that, right? I mean, when I see good writing, we have to admit that that's pretty good writing, right? And he is certainly not representative of North Korean writers, right? He's very distinct, distinguished among his peers. And he's classified as one of the top writers in North Korea. His style is, you're not going to see that kind of style in North Korea, not even today. Even Baek Nam-yong, to be honest with you, his style is very much like his peers. It sounds like every other literature. It's just that his approach is a little bit different. And so for me, the style, I can't really, distinguish style. Certain writers have better style, better language, better prose, I would say. But they're all kind of right there. Whereas Hong Seok-jung is like really up there, right? So within all this, within the similar style, it's all about who can approach, a theme from a different angle and make it interesting. And that's the way I had to approach North Korean literature. Right?
So it sounds like there's not a real diversity of individual writing styles.
Right, like a voice, right.
Yeah, right. Different voices.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
Well, all right. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're at 25 past. I want to thank everybody for coming and thank Immanuel for a really fascinating talk. So please join me in thanking Professor Kim, and thank you all for coming. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much.
And don't go away, Immanuel.
Okay.
We'll just have to talk paperwork when we're done here.